of the GoPro Hero 4. And taking a look at the actual body itself, it's not too different from the past generation GoPro cameras. If you take a look at the front of the camera, you can see we have an exposed lens with a on and off switch that also doubles as a mode button. At the top of the device, we have a record button, which also doubles as a enter button when you're using it in the menu modes. And on the side of the device, we have a Wi-Fi select button, as well as it doubles up as a settings button, which is a huge improvement. If you've ever used a previous generation GoPros, you'll notice that if you basically want the quickest way to change the actual modes and the settings of each of those modes, before you had to go through a whole bunch of different menus, and because of this small screen and the small resolution on this display, it is quite cumbersome. And since you don't have dedicated navigation button, again, it took a long time to change the different settings on the previous generation GoPros. But now you can just basically press that button in one time, and you have instant access to all of the different aspects of your whatever mode you're in. So if you're in video, you can easily change the specific resolution and the frame rate. You can change the field of view, whether you want wide, medium, and you can even change the picture profiles, which we'll get into in a little bit as well. Now, after spending a lot of time with the Hero 4, the biggest kind of gripe I have right now is that they've actually changed the battery. Not only is it a different battery from your older generation GoPros, so let's say if you have a GoPro Hero 3 and a whole bunch of them, you're going to have to basically invest in a whole set of new batteries, and you're definitely going to need to, because these batteries die very quickly. If you're shooting 4K with them on a regular basis, and if you have the Wi-Fi setting on, you're basically gonna barely run an hour on each of these batteries. Now, you will get generally better battery life if you do shoot at a lower resolution. So if you're shooting at, let's say, for example, 1080p at 30 frames per second, you are guaranteed at least an hour and a half of battery life. But if that's really quite poor, if you take a look at the old GoPro Hero 3s, that can get up to 3 hours in terms of battery life. So these certainly are pretty underperforming in terms of the battery life, and something of a concern if you do use these things on a big trip or something like that, and you're limited in terms of how many batteries you can have, and if you're especially going to use this as your main camera. By the way, when you are shooting 4K on these cameras, they do get very hot. After about 20 minutes of 4K recording, I did notice that the camera was heating up. Now, not quite a bit, but after, I would imagine, 45 minutes or even an hour of 4K recording, these small chips are going to get hot, because there's a lot of data going through them to the SD cards, and there's no active cooling solution in there. There's no fans, so you're really going to have to be careful. They're really designed for short burst mode if you are doing 4K, so they're really a 1080p camera in terms of their whole structure and the form factor of it. But certainly you can push it and use it for 4K all the time, but I would certainly be concerned of the longevity of the camera if you were to do that. Now, in terms of the durability, the camera itself, when it's not in its housing, is a fairly well-built camera. The buttons are very solid, and it's certainly made to a durable specification. Now, that being said, obviously, without its protective housing, it is very vulnerable. Firstly, the lens has no lens cap, and it is easy to get fingerprints on it, and you can kind of smudge up the image and kind of get bad results with your image quality if you do smudge up and touch the lens. So definitely want to make sure that it's mostly in its housing, even if you're not using it in a rainy environment. It just helps, I think, with keeping the camera in a good overall condition to give you the best results. Now, the housing on the new GoPro Hero 4 is pretty much identical to what you saw in the GoPro Hero 3 lineup of cameras. It's still very well built. You have good sealing overall, very well access to all of the important buttons, pretty much all the buttons that you have. It can go underwater for 131 feet or 40 meters, and it can survive most drops all the way from 15 to 20 feet, depending upon what kind of surface it lands on. So definitely a durable product, and obviously you can get different, more durable housing for it. There's stuff that's military grade that you can put these GoPros in, and there's no shortage of any accessories in terms of mounting and everything. Now, Now, speaking of accessories, if you take a look at the back of the Hero 4, you'll notice that it doesn't have any screen or any kind of display where you can review your footage and see what the heck you're recording. And basically, in order to have a display, you're going to have to buy an $80 LCD touch backpack, which is an accessory that will connect to your GoPro and allow you to review and monitor your footage. Now, thankfully, you don't have to get that, because since it has built-in Bluetooth and Wi-Fi capabilities, you can connect it to the GoPro app, which is both available for the iPhone marketplace, the App Store, as well as the Google Play Store for most of your Android devices out there. So, and this app is absolutely essential. In fact, it's much better than actually using the GoPro itself to set up different shots, because you have access to every single setting, every single option, as well as a real-time monitoring solution that you can hit record and stop recording with. It's absolutely essential if you're doing anything remote, which you're going to be doing, because this is what a GoPro is made for. Now, in terms of range, it uses a pretty short wave 2.4 gigahertz bandwidth, which certainly does not have a lot of range, and the signal demands a pretty high bandwidth for that connection of the communication to go through between the camera and the phone. So you can barely go about 20 feet before you start losing the signal. Now let's talk about some of these stills capabilities on the new Hero 4. And basically there's a lot of different options now. They've increased the megapixel count to 12 megapixels, and in terms of maximum burst rate, you can go up to 30 frames per second, which is pretty darn insane. In terms of time-lapse interval, you can go anywhere between 0 and 60 seconds. The ISO range for stills is 100 to 800 ISO. The low light performance on the camera in terms of stills is not good at all, but at least you do have a little bit higher ISO range than previous GoPro cameras. And the big feature that I really love is the long exposure mode. You can both use this in the traditional stills mode and in time lapses. So you could see right over here we have a really cool nighttime time lapse happening right now, which certainly opens the opportunity of this being a great time lapse camera, which already was. You have spot metering as well capabilities, as was seen in the last generation of GoPro cameras, as well as my favorite features on the new GoPro Hero 4, which has to do with the new Pro Tune options. And if you enable Pro Tune, what you can now do is customize your picture settings, both in terms of video and still. So that means you can change the value in terms of white balance, get a more appropriate white balance based on whatever kind of light source you have. You can change the color profile from the standard kind of contrasty GoPro preset to a more flatter one, so therefore you can color correct later on in post. You can change the ISO limit, the sharpness values, the shutter, actual exposure time, and even change exposure compensation. So a lot of great options, giving you a lot of versatility in this compact camera. Now basically, to illustrate the capabilities of the Pro Tune options, we're taking a look at a photo right now that's just shot with the standard default GoPro settings. And here you can see that the overall GoPro standard setting is definitely not bad. It's great if you want to just shoot something casually, but if you want the best image, you really want to shoot in this flat picture color profile that you see over here. And it doesn't look good straight out of the camera, but if we take this image and put it into our photo editing suites such as Lightroom or Photoshop, you can really change this image to look more accurate to whatever the day was like in reality, or to make it a more creative image and kind of go the direction where you want to go with the image. It gives you a little bit more capabilities. Obviously, we don't have a raw image capture capabilities on the GoPro Hero 4, which is unfortunate. That's an option what you would see in a professional DSLR camera, but unfortunately we don't have that still. But it gives you a little bit more capabilities using that JPEG image to make that image look as good as possible. And as you can see from the graded image, we definitely have an image that has a little bit more dynamic range, and overall details come out a little bit clearer as well. Now moving forward, the GoPro Hero 4 has a couple of different options in terms of audio capabilities as well. Now you can record with using the internal audio microphone, which I'll give you a little sample of that right now. So what you guys are now listening to is the GoPro Hero 4 microphone. This is the internal microphone, and this will give you a good idea in terms of how it sounds. We don't have the external case with it, so the waterproof housing is not on it. This is just the camera naked. But in terms of the overall quality, it's not bad. It definitely has some decent dynamic range, and definitely not too bad for an internal microphone. Of course, to get usable, proper audio for any kind of serious production, you're going to have to use some kind of dual system sound or plug in an external microphone, which you'll have to buy an accessory for if you want to do that directly into the camera. Now, moving forward, the Hero 4 has a whole bunch of recording options when it comes to video. Obviously, 99% of people buying this camera want the best video capturing capabilities possible. And in that form, you're definitely not going to be disappointed. Basically, when you're taking a look at the different resolution settings, you have a whole bunch of different options. We start with the 4K option. It has a resolution of 3840 by 2160 and record from 24 frames per second to 30 frames per second. There's a new option over here called the 4K Super View mode, which increases your field of view by a couple of degrees, and your maximum frame rate over there is 24 frames per second, which is certainly usable in most 24 frames per second projects, and movies are usually shot in that frame rate. Now, you also have options for 2.7K in both regular and Super View mode, as well as 1440p at 80 frames per second and 1080p at 120 frames per second, which is certainly a improved option from a last generation of GoPro cameras that can only do 60p at 1080. Unfortunately, we do not have 240 frames per second at 720p. It only records 120 frames per second. To do 240, you're going to have to bump down that resolution to WVGA resolution, which is one of the kind of biggest issues, because now we have smartphones like the iPhone 6 that can do 240 frames per second, and it's kind of a shame that a $500 camera can't do that. But that being said, there's a lot of other $5,000 cameras that can't even do 240 frames per second, so I shouldn't complain too much. Now, the low light performance on the Hero 4 has been improved. It can go up to 6400 ISO, which is pretty extreme. Now, certainly it's not the best low light camera in the world. There's still a lot of grain, a lot of noise that you'll come across when dealing with situations that you don't have ideal light in there. And certainly because of that small sensor and just the lens, can only deal with so much. But overall, definitely not bad. You have the option to shoot in extreme situations, so that's kind of nice. But now, in terms of a more realistic low light test, we're going to take a look at a quick clip indoors. Basically, there's some artificial light as well as some natural light. It's a pretty dim and gloomy day today, so you're not going to get the best lighting ever, but it'll give you a good example of how the camera shoots indoors. Now, furthermore, the 4K capabilities of this camera is certainly a big highlight tentpole feature, and why somebody would want to pay $500 for a GoPro. Now, in terms of the 4K quality, even if you're watching this video, which is, by the way, being uploaded in 4K, so you can watch it if you do have a 4K monitor, but if you don't have a 4K monitor, I think you can still see the difference. Looking at the source files themselves with my eyes, I can certainly see that there's a lot more details on the GoPro Hero 4 images compared to when you're recording 1080p on the camera. Now, the overall experience you get from the ultra wide angle perspective on the new Super View mode with 4K enabled is pretty incredible. It gives you a lot more detailed information about the environment that you're in. The color depth is better, the overall saturation level is better, and if you enable the Pro Tune features, you can adjust the colors even better, so you can get an even better image than what's coming straight out of the camera. The other thing that helps is if you do use the Super View mode in the lower resolutions. Let's say if you do want to shoot in 30 frames per second, you can go down to 2.5K, which is still higher than 1080p, and shoot 30 frames per second. And in that mode, you definitely get a lot of clarity, both in terms of motion and the overall kind of details that you get. Here you can see the details that are close into the camera and further away from the camera. It just gives you a more immersive experience. Additionally, there is an advantage of having a wider perspective because you also smooth out the overall image. The wider that you go, the more smoother your handheld and shaky footage looks. So if you take a look at most of these shots shot in that super view mode, they all look very steady, and even if you're running with the camera or doing anything extreme with a lot of vibration, such as mounting it on a car or moving motorcycle or something like that, it is dead smooth. It looks like somebody's using a Steadicam or some kind of gimbal system to keep those results. There is no stabilization. It's just the fact that the camera is so wide, you get that nice smooth look. Now, there is going to be a downside in having a super wide angle lens because you do introduce more distortion the wider that you go, especially if you don't have the best quality optics. Now, the optics on the GoPro are good. They do a good job in terms of minimizing distortion as much as possible, but if you're not using it for point of view shots, such as a helmet cam or something like that, yeah, and you're using it as a normal cam, pretty much everything that's straight will be bent and completely distorted, and faces and everything like that, they are in that extreme mode. Now, obviously, you can use the standard GoPro view and even crop down to kind of a medium perspective, but keep in mind these GoPro cameras are really designed for action, point of view photography, and really they're not made to be used as a traditional camera. Now, in terms of the internal recording formats, it's still using H.264 in terms of its codec. It would have been nice to see a more editing friendly codec. H.264 is excellent for finishing, but if you're gonna do some color grading and some editing, it's better to use something like ProRes, which a lot of the Blackmagic cameras have, and a lot of these smaller cameras are starting to introduce as well. Additionally, it would have been nice to have an intra-frame recording mode, an all-eye mode, which would definitely make some of the motion in the 24 frames per second look a little bit better, as well as motion for a slow motion better as well, because you'll have more information between the frames. Now, speaking of these slow motion capabilities, this camera does have pretty good capabilities in terms of 120 frames per second at 1080p, as well as 720p at 120 frames per second. The WVGA resolution is the only option for you to get higher than 120 frames per second at 240 frames per second. So if you do need a higher frame rate, you do have that, but it would have been nice to see 720p at 120 frames per second, since a lot of these smartphones that are coming out right now, such as the iPhone 6, actually have 720p at 240 frames per second slow motion capabilities. Now, just to quickly kind of sum up all my thoughts, we're going to do a good old-fashioned pros and cons list. We'll start with the pros over here. One thing that I definitely do like is the full 4K capabilities at 30 frames per second. I also like the super view options in 4K and lower resolutions. A big plus is also the Pro Tunes feature, which is going to expand the horizons of what these GoPros can do in terms of color and overall dynamic range. I really love how you can now do long exposure nighttime photography, since you can open up that shutter for up to 30 seconds, which is pretty darn incredible. So if you're into nighttime time lapses or even some astronomical time lapses, you certainly have some interesting capabilities. Furthermore, I like the mobile implementation with the GoPro app. It's absolutely essential if you don't have the rear screen to preview and to manage every aspect of the GoPro camera. Now, from a photo standpoint, I think the 30 frames per second burst mode is pretty darn remarkable, and 12 megapixels definitely gets you some really clear and very usable images. That's definitely an improvement from any last generation of GoPro cameras. And lastly, I do like that new setting mode button side dial, which doubles as a Wi-Fi toggle on and off as well. But I think that's a very handy thing that really makes navigating the settings of this GoPro Hero 4 a lot better than every other GoPro out there. Now, in terms of con, the first and foremost is the battery life sucks. 1 hour is not acceptable these days, especially when if you want to do 1080p, your last generation camera could do 3 hours, and the best you can do is barely hit an hour and a half. So definitely needs a big improvement there. Now, I would also like to see a standard direct microphone connection rather than using an adapter. Now, obviously, GoPro wants to make some money, so you do have to buy that adapter, but it would have been real nice to a lot of people to actually have just a standard microphone connection in the camera. I'm sure you can make room for it. That way you can get some real high quality audio straight into the camera without any adapters. The other issue is that 800 ISO for your photo limit is certainly unacceptable when your videos can go up to 6400 ISO. Additionally, it would have been nice to see some different recording format options. Certainly an option that gives you a little bit better control in terms of the color and dynamic range than H.264, and something a little bit more recording friendly like ProRes, and certainly all eye intra-frame recording would have been nice to see as well. The other thing too is there's no rear display, so if you don't have a smartphone, you're pretty much going to have to connect the camera to your computer or use the SD card and plug it into your computer to review your images. But if you're out in the field, if you don't have anything, it kind of sucks that you do have to buy an $80 option to this already $500 camera. Furthermore, there's no 240 frames per second in 720p mode. There's no RAW options for stills. And lastly, it only supports 64 gigabytes of SD internal recording. There is no 120 megabyte card supported. So that's certainly a shame, because with 4K video capabilities, you definitely want as much room as possible.